Thank you above all to Matti for joining us, and thank you to all of you in the audience for participating in this very special evening to talk about Matti's third book, Spies of No Country. I'll just say a couple of words of introduction and then get out of the way and let Matti do most of the talking. Um, in a sense, this book is a genesis story of Israeli spycraft, but it's much deeper than that. It's also a book about the complexities of identity in this part of the world. In the book, Matti really uses his characteristic blend of suspenseful storytelling and potent prose to dispel some simplistic narratives about the birth of this country. The book focuses, as we'll soon hear, on a fledgling Israeli intelligence unit called the Arab Section, which trained Middle Eastern immigrants to embed themselves undercover in the very countries that they were from. What I love about this book is that, like everything Matti writes, is deeply humane. And he writes in this book, I was looking less for the sweep of history than for its human heart. And with his eye for detail and for humanity, I think he succeeds. So, Matti, we have a lot of ground to cover. But first of all, thanks for joining us tonight.
And that introduction was so great. I don't want it to end. I think you should keep going for a couple more minutes.
I'm happy to go on for longer. I should add one technical note, which is that if any of you in the audience miss a particular section, a full transcript of this conversation will be available shortly after the event from your local Mossad branch. I hear that they're monitoring our conversation to make sure that Matti doesn't inadvertently spill some state secrets. But Matti, I thought we would begin, just since this is the genesis story of Israeli spycraft, with the genesis of the story and how you got hooked on it. How did this book begin in your mind?
First of all, thank you so much for talking to me about the book and for your kind words about the book, and thanks to the folks from Beit Avichai for hosting us. The story really started with a completely different story, which is the way it often works in journalism. At least in my case, you think you're reporting one thing and you end up in a completely different place. I was writing a book that eventually was called the Aleppo Codex, which is about Israel's, or you might say that it's the Jewish people's most important manuscript. That's an arguable point, but you can definitely make the case it's the most perfect copy of the Bible, of the Tanakh. And I was investigating the fate of this ancient Bible manuscript, and it eventually became my first book, which is also called the Aleppo Codex, the same name as the manuscript. And I was interviewing a very old spy, a retired Mossad agent by the name of Rafi Sinton, and I was hanging out with him. He was in his 80s at the time, and I was hanging out with him a lot in his living room in Modi'in, talking about an investigation that he'd carried out into the fate of this particular Bible manuscript. And Rafi was a Jew from Aleppo, Syria. He'd been born and raised there. He escaped Syria for Israel not long after the founding of the state. And in one of our conversations, he mentioned a friend of his who is an even older spy than Rafi. And he said that I should really go meet this guy. And I did. And that was the door to what eventually became Spies of No Country. It took almost a decade between the first interview with Rafi's friend, who is a man named Isaac Shoshan, Yitzhak Shoshan. Anyone who's read the book understands that he's one of the characters in the book. But at the time, to me, he just seemed like a very old storyteller. He was just a wonderful storyteller. And when I met him in his apartment in Bat Yam, I didn't know exactly what his story was. I didn't know why I'd come to see him, really. I'd only gone because Rafi had told me I should. And I ended up hearing, while sitting in his kitchen, this tiny little kitchen with green tiles, and he made me black coffee, and he told me a creation story about Israel that was like nothing I'd ever heard. I thought I knew about 1948. I thought I had a handle on Israeli history, and I kind of knew at least the outlines of the War of Independence, and his story was completely different. All of the characters in the story were people I'd never heard of. The unit at the center of these events, the Arab section, Hamachlaka Ha'aravit, is something I'd never heard of. And the story was so strange that it actually took me several years to even understand what the story was and why it might be important. And once I figured that out, it kind of, the ball began rolling, and it eventually became a book. But it took, I guess, from 2011, my first meeting with Isaac Shoshan, to 2019, the publication of the book. So a long gestational period for a pretty short book.
Was it easy for you to gain the trust of Isaac Shoshan? And was he relatively open with you, talking about the exploits of the Arab section?
It took time. If you've ever interviewed old spies, then you know that they're torn between the tradition of secrecy and also the Israeli tradition of not saying very much. Right? In the character of the Israeli hero is not to speak a lot, and if you enjoy telling stories, and if you're too out there and you're too public and you enjoy attention, then you're a kashkeshan, they would say in Hebrew. You're a I don't even know how to translate that word. Do you have a suggestion, Ben? A blatherer, someone who just talks. So they're torn between that tradition and the knowledge that their stories are great and the strong desire to tell them. So how it usually works is you'll have one interview in which they're quite cagey and they go around in circles. And if you're persistent enough, and if they like you, and if you can speak their language, and if they realize that you're not going away and you're not going to abuse information that they're giving you, then they open up, and it's occasionally a gold mine. And that's what happened in the case of Isaac Shoshan. I went back again and again to Bat Yam, to his little apartment, and I went with my digital recorder and I kept calling him and showing up, and he wasn't sure exactly what I wanted from him at first. And then he just got used to me coming. And I went again and again, in part because he was almost 90 at the time, and I wasn't sure how much time I had to interview him. And he was completely sharp. He remembered absolutely everything. And any one of his memories that I could cross-check against documents or against other people's memories checked out entirely. His memory was phenomenal. And I raced again and again because I wanted to get it all on tape. And as it happened, Isaac is still alive and well. He's 96, and I hope he lives until 120, but I didn't know that at the time. And that's how it began. With persistence, he opened up, and the story began to take shape.
All four of the protagonists in your book were in their 20s at the time. All of them were also native Arabic speakers. So Yakuba grew up in Palestine, Chavakuk in Yemen, I think, Gamliel and Isaac Shoshan in Syria. In what ways do you have a sense that discrimination against Mizrahim spilled into the Palma, or spilled into this most fabled unit of the Haganah?
So that's a big question in this book, and I was very careful when interviewing them and when telling their story not to project my own consciousness onto them and my own ideas about Israel in 2020 onto them, although this is in many ways a book about Israel right now. It's a creation story about the country, but I wouldn't have written it if I didn't think it was very relevant to present day Israel. But that doesn't mean that they saw things the way we see them now. When you hear the stories of these guys, and particularly the story of Gamliel, who is one of the four, Gamliel Cohen from Damascus, he's the most educated of the spies, and he's the best read. And when I say the most educated, I just mean that he finished high school. That was more than the other ones had at the time. And in his memories of this, he passed away about 20 years ago, so I didn't manage to interview him, but I had a very long transcript of an oral testimony he'd given about his life before he passed away. And it's phenomenal, just phenomenal material. And you can see that he was aware to an acute degree of his difference from everyone else on the kibbutz and in the Palmach. These guys escaped from the Arab world, understanding that Jews have no future in the Arab world, and being eager to join this great project, the Jewish national project that's going on in British Mandate Palestine, in the land of Israel. And they come from Syria, in the case of Gamliel, which is very close, right? For Jews escaping Europe, there's an ocean, it's an incredible journey to get here, but the Jews from Syria just walked across the border. It wasn't quite as simple as that, but the distance was very short. He arrives in the Shuv, in the land of Israel before the state, and discovers that he's too different from the other Jews to really fit in. In British Mandate Palestine in the 40s, 9 out of every 10 Jews are from Europe. 9 out of every 10 Jews are Ashkenazim, mostly Eastern Europe. And there's a very small minority of Jews who come from the Arab world, and they seem very strange to everyone else. They speak Arabic, that's their native language. They seem Arab in their mannerisms, in their appearance. And that difference, it turns out to be too hard to bridge. And what's common to the stories of all of the men who eventually end up in the Arab section is this initial attempt to assimilate. Most of them end up on kibbutzim. They want to be like the Sabras. They want to be, new Jews, as the Zionist movement imagined it. They want to be pioneers. They don't want to be like people in the Arab world. They ran away from the Arab world. They wanted to be something else. And it turned out that that wasn't really possible. They weren't going to be able to fit in. They were too different. This particular difference was very, very hard to surmount. And then right before the founding of the state, in the years between the Second World War and the War of Independence, the Palmach goes looking for these guys. The Palmach has set up a new intelligence unit, which is very amateurish and completely ad hoc. And they understand that the people who they need are people who can pass as Arabs, people who can cross the enemy line, cross enemy lines, and assume the identity of the enemy. So who can do that? These people who are marginal, these people whose difference has kept them from assimilating, has kept them from fitting in. That difference, their Arab identities, can be turned into a weapon in the service of the national movement. And that's when these people go from being marginal characters to being heroes of the creation of the state, but a very different kind of hero.
I think that's one of the great ironies of your book, is that you show that in the case of these four men and of the Arab section generally, it was precisely their failure to assimilate here that proved to be their greatest asset in allowing them to assimilate undercover. I want to stick with the second protagonist, Gamliel, who you mentioned for a moment. You write in the book that Gamliel found himself identifying in a deep way with the viewpoints of the Arabs he was impersonating. You say, quote, he felt himself adopting the personality of the people around him, seeing things their way. And then you continue when you write about all four of the spies that they were native to the Arab world, as native as Arabs. If the key to belonging to the Arabic nation was the Arabic language, as the Arab nationalists had claimed, they were inside. So were they really pretending to be Arabs, or were they pretending to be people who weren't Arabs pretending to be Arabs? I wonder if you could elaborate for a second on that particular twist.
Right. That is, I think, in many ways, the twist at the center of this book. The word that these guys use to describe themselves is an interesting one. They don't want to call themselves spies. We would call them spies. The title of the book is Spies of No Country, but at the time, they didn't like the word spies, which they thought was dishonorable. In Arabic, the word for spy is dishonorable. In English, spy sounds a bit glamorous, James Bond, but that's not the case in Arabic, and they didn't want to use that word. So they came up with a different word for themselves. And the word, which will be familiar to Hebrew speakers who are with us this evening, the word is mista'arvin. Mista'arvin, which is an incredible Hebrew word that describes something very strange. The word mista'arvin, which is a Hebrew word, you can conjugate it. Mista'arev, mista'arevet, mista'arvin, mista'aravti, mista'arva. You can conjugate it like a regular Hebrew word. The word means to become like an Arab. There's a word in Hebrew for the action of becoming like an Arab. And that's the word that they choose to describe themselves. They literally call themselves ones who become like Arabs. That's their job. And that raises a good question, which is how much of this is pretense? How much of this is fake? So they have this tent on the outskirts of a kibbutz where the Arab section is trained. And they are trained in Islam, for example. They're not Muslim, so they need to be trained to pray in a mosque. They need to know basic Muslim prayers. They need to know some Quran. But they don't need to be taught Arabic because that's their native language. They don't need to be taught Arab culture because that's where they're from. But the question is, are they ones who become like Arabs? Are they Mista'arvim, or are they Arabs who are pretending not to be Arabs, pretending to be Arabs? Who are these people? And it's a good question, and I don't pretend to answer it in the book, and I think people can identify themselves however they want, but it's certainly true that things are not that simple. The idea that there are Jews and Arabs and the line between those two groups is ironclad and unbridgeable. That's not true. Things are more blurry, and the Arab section existed in that blurriness, a blurriness that to a large extent has disappeared since then. But that's what's so interesting to me about these guys. If we just call them spies, then we miss everything that's amazing and complicated about their story.
Take us through a bit how, narratively, how did they actually get to Beirut?
So, well, actually, maybe I can show. I have a few pictures here that I can show you of them in Beirut, and maybe I'll just show the pictures so we can imagine who these guys are and what Beirut looked like at the time, and then we'll talk about how they got there. Let's see if I can make this work. Hold on. All right, we might have to forgo the photographs. That's for some reason it is not cooperating. Wait, one last try here before we let everyone just imagine what the spies look like. Can you see the three spies?
Mm-hmm.
So this is Beirut, 1948. And this is a picture of three of the Mistarvim, three of the Israeli spies. But it should be said that at the time that the story begins in Beirut in the spring of 1948, there is no Israel. So they're not Israeli spies. The word Israeli hasn't been used. There's something, again, much less clear. These are Jews from the Arab world who are assuming a new kind of Jewish identity, but it's all very chaotic and unclear. On the left, the man with the mustache who's on our left is Gamliel. That's Gamliel Cohen, who was born with the name Jamil Cohen in the Jewish quarter of Damascus. There used to be a lot of Jews with names like Jamil Cohen. Today it sounds very strange to have someone named Jamil, but he Hebraicized his name to Gamliel as part of his effort to fit in. Here he's operating under a third identity, that of a Palestinian Muslim from Jaffa, whose name is Yusuf el-Hamid. So here you have Yusuf el-Hamid, also known as Gamliel Cohen, also known as Jamil Cohen, and they're all the same guy. In the middle, you have my man, the one who I interviewed, I hope he lives until 120, Isaac Shoshan, who is the one in glasses. And he is using an identity here, also of a Palestinian Muslim, Abdul Karim Muhammad Sidki. So those two characters are among the four main characters in the book. The one on the right is also a fascinating character, but I don't have a lot of material on him. So he's mentioned in the book, but not in a central way. His name is Shimon Choresh. All three of these are Israel's first spies, kind of among the founders of what eventually becomes the Mossad, which had very modest beginnings. In this picture, we see Isaac Shoshan, also known as Abdul Karim. He's closest to us, wearing glasses. This is him driving an Oldsmobile that the cell purchases in Beirut and uses as a taxi. They run a kiosk where they sell sandwiches, and they drive a taxi, which is a way of getting around the country without arousing suspicion. So they have an Oldsmobile, and they use it for intelligence reasons. And as you know, if you've read the book, they also use it for all kinds of other reasons, because these are very young men who are by themselves in a very exciting city, and not everything that they do is operational. In the in the background is Havakuk Cohen. Havakuk was born in Yemen, as you mentioned, and he is an incredible character, a watcher. He authored some of the most interesting documents that I've ever seen from the 1948 war. He had an incredible story of his own. We know relatively little about him because I don't think I'm giving away too much to say that he didn't survive the time, but he left enough writing that allowed me to recreate his character and thinking he was a beloved character in the Arab section. Lastly, this gentleman here is Yakuba. Yakuba Cohen was born in British Mandate Palestine in Jerusalem, and he was the most outrageous character of my four main characters, the most outrageous character in the Arab section, extremely brave, an incredible storyteller, full of bluster, and the stories about Yakuba and the stories that he told about himself are quite incredible and could have filled a book on its own. Here you see him dressed in the uniform of an Arab militiaman before the founding of the state. But he's a Jew who grew up near the vegetable market in Machane Yehuda. He grew up in Machlaot. That's Yakuba. Those are the main characters of the story. So if we go back to your question, which is how these guys got to Beirut, in the spring of 1948, they'd already been active inside the borders of British Mandate Palestine for the duration of the war, for a few months. And they'd started by gathering intelligence, sneaking across the line, picking up conversations in cafes, hanging out at the post office. Then they graduate to sabotage. They carry out a few acts of sabotage, including a pretty dramatic one in Haifa in February 1948. From there, they graduate to assassination. They attempt the assassination of an important Arab military and religious leader in Haifa. These are all stories that are in the book. And then in May 1948, events come to a head. And if you know about the war in 1948, then you know that there are two stages of that war. There's a civil war inside British Mandate Palestine, and then an invasion of Arab armies after the British leave in May. And this is all about to come to a head that spring when a crucial battle happens in Haifa. And the Haganah, the pre-IDF, what eventually becomes the IDF, starts behaving for the first time like a real army. And they have units, and they maneuver, and they manage to conquer Haifa. And there's a wave of refugees, of Arab refugees who flee Haifa in April 1948, heading north to Lebanon. And the Palmach understands that this is an opportunity, that if there's a wave of refugees fleeing British Mandate Palestine for Lebanon, it's an opportunity to get their spies into the Arab world. So they take a few men from the Arab section and they insert them into the wave of refugees. And these guys are sent from the top of Mount Carmel in Haifa. They walk down the mountain and they find a group of refugees who are waiting for a bus to take them away from Haifa to Lebanon, and that they flee as refugees to Lebanon. And this is April 1948 when it happens, so there is no state of Israel. When the state of Israel is founded a few weeks later, they don't know, because they have no way of communicating with home. They leave without a radio. They don't have a radio. Israeli intelligence, what eventually becomes the Mossad, does not own a radio. For a long time, they don't own a camera. It's so low tech that it's almost impossible to imagine. So when the state is founded a few weeks later, they have no way of knowing that it happens. And all they know is what they read in the Arab newspapers, which is that the Arab armies are victorious, and that the Jewish state is, stillborn. And it's only weeks after that they find out that, in fact, the state has been founded. And if you kind of catch them at this incredible moment where they're in Beirut and they're very young guys, they're in their early 20s, they're barely out of their teens, they have no idea if they're ever going to have a home to go back to. We know that the Jews win in 1948 and the state exists. They have no idea that that's going to happen. In fact, in 1948, it seems quite possible that is not going to happen. And you have these kids who are Jewish refugees from Arab countries pretending to be Arab refugees from a Jewish country. And there are so many layers of displacement and identity confusion in that story that come together to make what is, for me, the power of the story of these men.
What did they actually do once they were in Beirut?
Right, so it wasn't a James Bond movie. There were very few glamorous and dramatic exploits, although there were some, and I make sure to tell them all in the book. There's a very dramatic story involving a Nazi yacht that belonged to Adolf Hitler. Much of what they do is very prosaic. They, as I mentioned, they run a kiosk and they drive a taxi and they try to understand what is happening in the Arab world. They try to understand what people are thinking. They try to understand what's happening with the Palestinian refugees. That's a major preoccupation for the Zionist leadership. They try to survive without making any mistakes, because for these guys, a single grammatical error, right? If they speak Arabic and they say something wrong, something in the wrong accent, they die. And about half of the Arab section doesn't survive the war because they're not good enough. They were barely trained. There's no spy school. There's no, Langley. It's completely a seat of the pants operation. And of about a dozen guys in the Arab section at the beginning of the war, only half of those men are alive at the end. So they're trying not to mess up. They're trying to get as much information as they can. Yakuba, the one with the kafia we saw, he's very interested in blowing things up. He has a few very grandiose plans of things that he wants to blow up in Lebanon, most of which don't come to fruition. They're trying to gather intelligence. They get entangled with women because these are very young men who are away from home for a very, very long time. And one of the entanglements almost gets everyone killed. And they survive for 2 years in Beirut until they're summoned back home in the spring of 1950, when the state of Israel is 2 years old, and they're extracted from Beirut in a rubber dinghy, and they make it back to Haifa. And when they come to the state of Israel, it's the first time they've ever been there, because when they left, there was no state of Israel, right? It's their first visit in 1950. They're the last unit of the Palma to be dismantled. They weren't dismantled with the rest of the Palma in 1948 because they weren't in Israel, so they had to wait until they came back. And when they come back, they realize that they're officers in the Israeli Defense Forces in Tzahal, but they've never met anyone from the Israeli Defense Forces. So that's also kind of a beautiful, and I think for some of them, maybe unhappy moment, the moment in 1950 where they finally make it back.
Do you have the sense that their experience fleeing as in the guise of Palestinian refugees gave them or colored their post-1950 lives vis-a-vis the Palestinian-Israeli question? Do you have the sense that for some of them, it gave them a certain sense of empathy, since they're now double refugees, since they've lived among these refugees who had to flee their homes?
It's a great question. And in my many hours with Isaac Shoshan, I tried to understand exactly what his political angle was. It's very difficult to understand from what these men wrote. And if you pore over what Gamliel wrote, for example, there is a political attitude that becomes clear. And I think it is the political attitude of most of the men in the Arab section, which is that they were deeply empathetic to the other side. And they had lived among the enemy, but they didn't really consider an enemy. It's much more blurry for them. And Gamliel had a long career in Israeli intelligence after this episode, and he's undercover under a false identity for more than a decade. I mean, he's been through a lot, and in the in 80s and 90s, when he's already an old man, he says he's never experienced friendship among Jews as he experienced among Arabs. He has very warm feelings for the other side, but their Zionism never wavers. They understood that Jews needed a state, and they understood it as Jews from the Arab world, I think, better in many cases, better than a lot of Jews who came from Europe, or at least they understood what this would require better than many Jews who came from Europe. They understood the Arab world, and they understood what it meant to reverse the hierarchy inside the Islamic world, which is what the creation of Israel did. They understood that this war was not going to end very quickly. And yet they're completely committed to the cause. They're grateful to the state for having rescued them from a miserable fate in the Arab world. And if we look at the fate of minorities in the Arab world, not just the Jews from today, it's clear that the movement of Jews from that world into the state of Israel was ultimately good for most of them, maybe not in the first generation, which is an important point to make. But looking back, you wouldn't want Jews to have still been in a place like Iraq or Syria when those places fell apart over the last decade. So they were grateful to the state. They identified entirely with the state, but they always remained humane and empathetic about the other side. They were the first to realize what the refugee problem was and what it meant. They were reporting from Amman in 1949 before the Zionist leadership really understood what the story with the refugees was. And their reports are touching and empathetic, and their combination of complete, I would say, commitment to the Jewish national project and the understanding that the future of the Jews requires the existence of a Jewish state. That understanding, coupled with a deep empathy for the other side and they felt no need to dehumanize the other side or dismiss their concerns. They understood the other side. They just didn't agree with them, and they understood that their goal was different. And that's a very hard line to maintain. And one of the beautiful things about these guys is that they did maintain it, and they seem to have maintained it until the end of their lives. And as a journalist, I've also tried to imitate them. That's the line that I strive for. I'm not sure that I always succeed, but I try. And in that way, I think these men are models.
I don't know if you say so explicitly in the book, but I remember coming away from the book with a very deep sense that their message, in some sense, the message of these four men and of the people that they represent, the community that they represent, went unheeded. That their voices, that they could have contributed something, had only, in this case, the Ashkenazi establishment paid more attention to what they could have said. And that brings us to some of the contemporary edge, I think, of what you reveal in the story. You write in the book that contemporary Israel makes sense only through a Middle Eastern lens, which is one reason that Westerners find it harder and harder to figure out. Maybe you could say something about that, about how their voices went unheeded, how their perspective went unheeded, and maybe even to the present day still goes unheeded.
That's really what led me to write the book, I think, with an understanding that we've missed something big about the nature of the state, or at least I missed something big. If you grew up in a North American Jewish community, as I did, I'm from Toronto, and I think this is true of most Jews in the diaspora, and I think it's true of many Israelis, you have a very European story about the state of Israel. So you know that there was Herzl and there were pogroms in Europe, and there was the kibbutz idea, the socialist idea, and of course there was the Holocaust, and then there were characters like David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, and that's very much the Israeli story as it's told. But if we look at the Jewish population of Israel, only half of the Jewish population here came from Europe. Only half of the Israeli Jewish population has roots in the Islamic world, mainly in the Arab world, and in non-Arab Islamic countries like Turkey and Iran. So how can we tell a story about Israel that doesn't take that into account? Like, how can we treat half of the Jews in the Jewish state as a footnote to the story? So I was looking for a way to get at that. And I thought it would be very effective to tell, or potentially effective to tell a story about the creation of the state in which there are no Ashkenazim. I just wondered what that would look like. What would it look like if all the heroes in 1948, or in a particular story about 1948, came from the Arab world? How would they have seen it? How would they have experienced it? And that's what I'm trying to do in this book, not just because I think it's an interesting historical detail, but because I think Israel right now can't be understood if you come at it with the old story. So if you're looking at Israel now and you're looking for the kibbutz and the Palma and Moshe Dayan in Europe, you're not going to find it. But if you're looking for the Middle East, or if you're looking for an iteration of the Jewish world of the Middle East, which existed for thousands of years, then you're going to find something pretty close, right? There are 1 million Jews who are native to the Islamic world in the 1940s. All of them, with very few exceptions, are rendered homeless, and most of them come here. And if you don't understand their Judaism, and if you don't understand their history and their relationship with Islam, and if you don't understand their music, or their cuisine, very little about the state of Israel makes sense. And I occasionally meet visitors, Jewish visitors, who identify very strongly with Israel, who come to this country and are completely bewildered by it. Even on the level of cuisine, where's the Jewish food? Well, why are there no bagels here? Now you can find bagels in Israel, but Israelis tend to think of it as American food, not as Jewish food, because the Jewish food that people eat here is heavily informed by the cuisine of the Levant and North Africa, which is where a big chunk of the population came from. If you turn on, just looking at another example, music, if you turn on a pop radio station here, the dominant pop genre in Israel is called Mizrahi, which means literally Eastern, and it's kind of a Mediterranean, Arab, Greek, Western melange, but it's definitely not Western music. It's Eastern music, and it sounds discordant often to Western ears. And why is that the dominant pop form in Israel? Well, because this is more a Middle Eastern country, in my opinion, than it is a Western country. And if we want to understand what Israel is now, we have to be able to look at Jews who came from the Islamic world as main characters in the story, not the only main characters in the story, but as main characters in the story. And we can't keep telling the story about European pioneers and European leaders, and on the fringes, in the footnotes, there are Jews from Yemen who have funky food, and Jews from North Africa who brought some cool music. No, the story of the state of Israel is the story of the Jews of the Islamic world as much as it is the story of the Jews of Europe. Numerically, it's 50-50. And this book is an attempt to address that.
And one more form of bewilderment that I want to press you on before we move on. The bewilderment not vis-a-vis only cuisine and music, but also bewilderment vis-a-vis the contemporary Israeli political reality. This is the most common form of bewilderment when we speak of Western observers. You've written very powerfully and compellingly about Western media and its perceptions of this place. But I want to read something that you wrote in the New York Times, where, by the way, I should tell the audience, Matti is a contributing opinion writer. And you say that the dominance of the political right in recent years, obviously the Israeli political right, comes far less from the settler movement, as foreign observers tend to think, than from the collective memory of Israelis who remember how vulnerable they were as a minority among Muslims and grasp what this part of the world does to the weak. I wonder if you could share with us a word or two about political bewilderment as it sort of is being grafted onto the ancestral memory of some of the people that you write about in this book.
Right, so it's a great question. And it was on my mind as I wrote it, although the book isn't overtly political, it doesn't get into the politics of today in a direct way, but it's hard to avoid the fact that the discourse in Israel is in many ways an ethnic one, or at least the fault lines in much of the Israeli discourse are fault lines between Jews who came from Europe and Jews who came from the Middle East. And it's obscured in many ways, and people looking at this from the outside often think that when we argue about left and right, it means like left and right in America, even though what makes you left and right in Israel has nothing to do with what makes you left and right in America, right? If you take the entire Israeli political spectrum and transplant it to America, basically everyone's in the Democratic Party. We have, free access to abortion, and we have state health care, and we have tight gun control, and any number of examples. The right-left divide here is about an attitude toward the Arab world. If you think that compromise on Israel's part will lead us to, better situation vis-a-vis the Arab world, then you're on the left, basically. And if you think that compromise actually makes things worse because it shows weakness and it invites further hostility and further attacks, that's a right-wing position. That's a gross oversimplification, but basically that's what makes you left and right in Israeli society. And if you look at the political divide here, it would be nice to avoid it, but you can't. That, the base of the Labor Party and the left was traditionally Ashkenazi, and the base of the Likud Party was traditionally Mizrahi, which is a terrible, generalization for everyone who came here from the Islamic world. Just like Ashkenazi is a ridiculous generalization for anyone who came here from the Christian world. So, I'm Ashkenazi and the Satmar Rebbe is Ashkenazi. Are we really a member of the same group? But these are generalizations that we use. But there's certainly something about the outlook that came with the Jews who came from the Islamic world that led them to different conclusions about how to handle our place in the Middle East. And as someone who came from a Western country in the 90s, came with a lot of Western condescension, as one does without even being aware of it. Of course, we understand the problems and we will explain to everyone how it can best be sorted out. After 25 years in the country, I'm convinced that every taxi driver in Jerusalem knows more about the Middle East than, knew more about the Middle East in utero than I do as a 43-year-old journalist. So there's a certain knowledge of the way things work here that's very, very important. That was disdained by the country's leadership because it didn't take these people seriously. It didn't take their knowledge seriously. It didn't take their Judaism seriously. Everyone was supposed to ditch their traditions and become secular and become as much like kibbutzniks as possible. And a lot was ruined in that process, and a lot was missed, because if you're building a Jewish state in the Middle East and you have an enormous population of Jews from the Middle East, that's a good thing. You can work with that. That's a bridge. That should inform your own understanding. Maybe these people have something to say about being a Jew inside the Islamic world, because the Israeli project, the Zionist project, it's not at all what it thought it was doing, but basically it was taking all of us and making us Jews in the Islamic world. That's not what they thought they were doing, but that's in fact what they were doing. And here we are. And only now is the tradition that came from the Islamic world, the Jewish traditions from the Islamic world, only now is that being taken seriously. And only now has that music really become, freed from being considered déclassé. And only now is that culture really being embraced. And it's late. It's late, and it should have been done earlier. And if it had been done earlier, I think we could have gained a lot of wisdom in the way we handle the rest of the region, what's possible, what's not possible, what kind of arrangements work, what kind of arrangements don't work. Maybe we need to think in a more rounded way and less in sharp angles. There a lot.
Let me stop you there. Speaking of what's possible and what's not possible, as you know, in September, the so-called Abraham Accords were signed at the White House, and normalizing relations with the UAE, with Bahrain. Do you think that what you're talking about in terms of expanded horizons of possibilities is at work here? In other words, that there's a certain generational shift, and that this normalization between some of these Arab states and Israel is something that will be expanded in the next years?
In some ways, these agreements are an expansion, and in some ways they're kind of smaller than the old dreams of peace, right? The old dreams of peace were about a new Middle East. That's the way Shimon Peres put it. Shimon Peres, very much of the labor establishment, very much someone who came at this from a European angle. It was almost utopian. The Middle East was going to be at peace, and the borders were going to come down, and we were all going to move around. And I love that idea, and were it possible today, I would be behind it 100%. But it's not possible, and I think many of the Jews who came here from the Islamic world understood that pretty early on. And instead, what we have in this case is kind of a deal. It's not utopian. There's not a lot of love and brotherhood necessarily, but there's an understanding of reality. We have shared interests. Let's do business. Let's see what we can what kind of deals we can make. And I think that's very healthy. And I think that's maybe the best we're going to get. And I think that it's not a coincidence that one of the first overt events in the new Abraham Accord process was the arrival of the first open Israeli delegation to the Emirates. And an Israeli plane, there have been covert ties for years, right? But this is the first overt delegation. They're coming to finalize the peace accord. And an Israeli plane touches down on a tarmac in the UAE, and out of the plane comes not, a kibbutznik. Out of the plane comes a little guy with a big kippah named Ben Shabbat. He's the head of the National Security Council, and he stands at the podium at the airport, and he starts speaking fluent native Arabic. His family's from North Africa, and he's a native Arabic speaker. And the whole aesthetic of the thing was completely different. One of the first things that happens in the kind of realm of PR after the accord is signed is that they release a Mizrahi pop song starring an Israeli Mizrahi singer and a singer from the Emirates. And they do this kind of cheesy but very interesting music video, but the aesthetic is Middle Eastern. There's no attempt to make this look like Europe, which was the attempt of the Labour Party in the 90s. This is a very Middle Eastern kind of peace, and that's not coincidental. That's very much where Israel is right now. We've become much more of a Middle Eastern country than Israel's founders ever imagined or intended.
I want to ask one final question before turning it over to our audience, because that's often the most interesting part of such an evening. But I wonder if if you have any ideas about sort of this enduring fascination with Jews as spies, from your four protagonists to Eli Cohen, this fascination also with the capability, some would say unique capability of the Jew to assimilate, to take different forms. What accounts for this? We have Netflix series, you've written about as well. What accounts for this fascination with Jews and spies?
It's a thought that occurred to me as I was writing this book. I hadn't thought about it really before, and I know that you also have written about shape shifting and the Jewish, affinity for flexible form, and we'll talk about that when we talk about your amazing book about Kafka next month. But there's something going on here that's much deeper than a story about spies, and it all kind of comes together with the Arab section in the 40s in an interesting way. The Arab section is founded originally in 1941, and it's founded by the British who rule Palestine at the time. They need people who can pretend to be other people. And in spy movies, it's very easy to pretend to be, a different nationality or someone from a different country. But in reality, it's very, very hard to assume another identity because there are a million tiny nuances that will give you away. I'm Canadian, for example, and I speak English, but if you send me to Louisiana to fit in with the natives, I might be able to fake it for a couple of days, but someone eventually is going to nail me. Even if I go to, even if I went to New York, you can't really fake it. It's very, very hard to fake it. And the British have trouble finding people who can spy for them. In the Middle East, for example, where the population in the Arab world is almost entirely in the German camp, they need people who can pretend to be Germans. They need people who can pretend to be Yugoslavs. And they realize that in the land of Israel and Palestine, they have a gold mine because they have people who are completely loyal to the Allies who can pass as dozens of different nationalities perfectly. So at the same time, in 1941, the British set up a few different sections. One is called the German section, which is a small unit made up of Jews from Germany who are trained to pretend to be Wehrmacht soldiers. And they wear Nazi uniforms and they sing Nazi songs, and they're supposed to disrupt the German occupation of Palestine when that happened, which was expected to happen in 1941. And at the same time, they set up an Arab section, which is a section of Jews who are loyal to the Allies, but Jews who come from the Arab world, Jews who can pass as Arabs. And it's the British who first realized how useful this could be. And when the cooperation between the British and the Jews falls apart, as it does as the war progresses, the Jewish leadership realizes that this is worth preserving. If you have a unit that can spy across enemy lines, if you have a unit of people who can pass, that should be preserved. But it's a deep Jewish quality, one that doesn't just start in 1941. The doubleness of Jewish identity is precisely what's getting Jews killed in Europe at the same time that the Arab section is founded. It's this German suspicion of people who seem like them but aren't them. They speak German, but they're not German. Who are these people and what are we supposed to do? Well, we need to tag them and quarantine them and eventually kill them because of this double identity. And it's all happening at the same time. And that doubleness exists in some of our greatest stories about ourselves. If you look at the Bible, right, we have a story about this girl named Esther who lives in Persia. And Esther is a Persian name. Her Hebrew name is Hadassah. So she has some kind of double identity, and she's placed in the court of the king to be there when the time comes so she can help her people. And in that story, the spy master, the guy who's running the operation, is God. At least so you're supposed to understand. So it's not, exactly the same as the Arab section, but it's definitely a story about how we use our double identities as Jews for the good of the Jewish people. The story of Joseph might be the classic version of that story. There's this kid from Canaan whose name is Joseph, and he ends up in Egypt, and he has a different name. His name in Egypt is Tzofnat Pa'aneach, and he's so Egyptified that even his own brothers can't recognize him. And when the time comes, he's in the right place to help. The story of Moses is a story of double identity. The story of Moshe is a story of a kid who's raised to be something else, but he's more than one thing. So this is a deep Jewish story. And the story of the Arab section is one, small emanation of it, but there's something much bigger going on here.
I think you should write something on shape-shifting chameleon-like Jews from Yosef and Moshe through Woody Allen's Zelig. I would read such a piece. I also can't help thinking what Quentin Tarantino would do with the story of the German section, Jews dressed up in SS uniforms. But that's for another story.
Quentin, as you know, Quentin Tarantino is now one of us. He married an Israeli, and I think he lives in Israel. So I think we can get him on the story of the German section. The results would probably be horrific, but you would have to bear full responsibility for it.
Well, thank you so much, Matti. I would like to offer enough time for our audience to weigh in, and I wonder if Tamar can help us with some of the questions that have been submitted. And I think we have another 10 minutes or so to take some audience questions.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Ben and Matti. It was fascinating discussing Jewish identity. I mean, we start with the book about spies, and as Jews, we always end up digging into our identities. I'm going to start with a question from Rachel, which is related to a topic you raised a few minutes ago, the accords with UAE and Bahrain. Rohr wants to know, Matti, if you're going to share your stories with people, with Arab readers in the region, if they're interested in hearing your stories.
Thank you for that question. I would love nothing more than to see Arabic translations of my books, and specifically of this book. Nothing, as far as I know, that I've written has been translated into Arabic. The book market in the Arab world is not very strong, and of course, there's a lot of antagonism toward books written by Israelis, although some do get translated, but mine haven't, unfortunately. And Yet, exactly. If anyone on this call is owns an Arabic publisher, then talk to me afterwards. But I would love for people in Lebanon to read this book, and I would love to get reader responses from people who live in Beirut and maybe remember something or heard something. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened, but I hope it will. Maybe it will.
So Sean wants to know, regarding your interviews that you used as a source for this work, is there any place that English languages researchers can access them, or are there any museums, or was there a request not to publish them?
The raw materials of the research, the transcripts of Gamiel's memories and Yakuba's memories are all publicly available at Beta Palma, which is the Palma Museum. They were amassed by a different historical project called Beti Galalon, but those certainly exist. The IDF archive, Khion Sahal, has the Arab section papers. Some are still classified. Many were declassified at my request, and those are available there. They do require, you need Hebrew to access it, but much of the information is available now. When I applied to the archive for access this information, I was surprised to find that the Arab section material was still classified. It had been 70 years. And it seems to me, although no one said this explicitly, that one of the main reasons that it was still classified was that no one had ever asked, as hard as it is to imagine.
Okay, so some of the questions are getting a little complicated. This is regarding Trump claiming to have fostered the new relationship with the Arab state. So how much did Trump and his people actually contribute to these developments, the Abraham Accords? Or is it more of an evolution of politics in the region, Shia states and Sunni states? And what are your thoughts on this?
I think that obviously there are specific political circumstances that contributed to what has happened. A lot of them have to do with the Trump administration. A lot of them have to do with the Obama administration and the way America's allies in this region felt isolated and kind of worried about the rise of Iran. But I think that what's happening is related to the subject of the book, which is there's a growing understanding, certainly among Israelis, and I think increasingly in the Arab world, that Israel is not a foreign implant. Israel is part of the region, not just because we're physically in the region, but because a big part of our population was in the Islamic world before the founding of Israel. And the people who are here are not just people who came from a different kind of tragic set of circumstances. They're your parents' former neighbor from Baghdad, right? They're the guy who ran the corner store in Cairo. These people are all here. And if you're open to that reality, then there's a lot you can do. There are doors that can be opened. And I think that is changing. It's changing, very slowly. Again, it's changing when shared, cold, hard interests align, which is the case with the Gulf. But as time goes on, I think there is a greater acceptance of what this country is, which is a Middle Eastern Jewish country, not a country of Jews who happen to be dumped in the Middle East, but a country of Middle Eastern Jews, both those who came from the Islamic world to Israel in the mid-20th century, and those of us whose families came from Europe, but who have been Middle Easternized over generations in the Middle East and who would no longer really be recognizable to Jews from Warsaw, and increasingly are not really recognizable to Jews from New York either. So the process here is one of Middle Easternization. And I think these accords are at least in part connected to that.
Okay, Phoebe wants to know, how do you think we can best educate American Jews and non-Jews about the history of Mizrahi Jews?
buy everyone 3 or 4 copies of my book.
Great answer. And we posted the link at the beginning of the chat. If anyone is interested, the link is there for purchasing.
And 5 or 6 copies will make the education process much, much smoother. No, I think that we need to begin by putting aside the good old stories about Israel, which I love. I'm not saying that, because I don't like the stories about the Palmach. I love the stories about the Palmach, and I love hearing stories about, the kibbutz and the early Zionist leadership. It's a phenomenal story of people who changed Jewish fate in our times, no less. But that story does not explain Israel anymore. And if we insist that it does, we're not going to make any headway, and people are going to come to Israel and be confused. Many Jews in North America are already just baffled by the state. They can't figure out why we do what we do. And part of that is because the observers who tell the story of Israel in the media are either ignorant or ideologically hostile in many cases, not in all cases. But part of it is just because the experience of Jews in the Middle East and the experience of Jews in America are completely different experiences. And the longer that goes on with every generation, we become harder and harder to understand to each other. So we have to understand that these are 2 different places. These are 2 very different Jewish worlds. We have to understand that we're not necessarily going to make sense to each other. And once we understand that, then you can make a leap into something foreign and strange and understand the very different way that Israel ticks, the mechanism that makes this country tick, which is a Jewish mechanism, but it's one very different than what makes the North American Jewish community tick in 2020.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry we can't accept all the questions, but it's been a fascinating talk hearing both of you. And next time it's going to be the opposite. Matti will be interviewing Ben about Kafka's Last Trial. It's going to be, I think, the first book event. It's a new book, award-winning book. So please join us, and we'll be happy to see you at all future events. I see there's other questions coming up. If Matti and Ben have the time, they can check out the chat. Otherwise, we'll have to end our evening here. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Good evening. Thank you, Matti and Ben.
Thank you so much, Tamar. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Matti. And for all of you in the audience, let me just close by saying, if you haven't already read this book, go out and buy it. It's an exquisite exploration into the stories, beneath the stories that this country tells itself. And it's deeply humane, deeply suspenseful. Cannot be recommended more highly.
Thank you, Ben. We'll see you all on January 10th for discussion of Kafka's Last Trial.
Have a good night.